It is one of the largest and most important structural reforms in generations. We are at the crossroads of history. It's an inconvenient and incontestable truth. That's the thing about the climate change debate. There's no shortage of superlatives. And the Prime Minister's launch of the long-awaited white paper was predictably rich with portentous adjectives.
Climate change is one of the greatest enduring challenges that we face as a nation and as an international community. It is a threat that, if left unaddressed, has the capacity permanently to affect our way of life. The inconvenient truth, the incontestable truth of climate change, is that a decision not to act is in fact an active decision to place the next generation at grave risk.
Kevin Rudd came to office promising action on climate change. It was one of the key platforms of his election victory last year, and the expectations on his government to deliver have been high. Professor Garnaut set the scene with his recommendation of cuts by 2020 of between 5 and 15%, with an aspirational target of 25% if the global community agreed on an acceptable international commitment. The government's response is to embrace the first recommendation and put the higher aspirations on hold, at least until after 2020. But there's no doubt it is a target.
By the end of 2020, we will reduce Australia's carbon pollution by between 5% and 15% below 2000 levels.
We will not walk away from climate change!
You're the real Australian. We're absolutely appalled by the Prime Minister's lack of courage in addressing climate change, which is arguably the biggest threat to this nation and to humankind in human history. And today he failed his responsibility as leader of this nation. As I said to the young woman who was protesting and being attended to by 6 of the Prime Minister's men today, you're the Australian with the real courage in this room.
The Greens have been pushing for cuts of at least 40% by 2020. That was never under consideration, and the political leadership and environmental activists were today well prepared to make their point both inside and outside the National Press Club. No doubt there'll be plenty more to come. But Kevin Rudd says the critics fail to understand the true impact of the targets. Because of Australia's projected population growth, on a per-person basis, he says the cuts of 5 to 15% here more than measure up to the far bigger cuts proposed by Europe in particular.
If the Europeans were to embrace the same per capita obligations that we're about to embrace, then you'd be seeing European reductions in the vicinity of 30%.
Kevin Rudd says the Australian targets are appropriate and responsible. They are, above all, about getting the balance right. He says he expects criticism from those who think he's gone too far as well. But the White Paper is a conservative and cautious response to an issue the Prime Minister once described as the great moral challenge of our generation. And the opposition so far has come mostly from one side of the argument. Not long after the protesters were removed from the scene, the more structured Green interests also queued up to make their point.
The Australian government were given a mandate at the last election for strong action on climate change. And today, we haven't seen a genuine response.
Kevin Rudd has betrayed every Australian that voted for him for climate action.
It is simply not enough to protect our future.
These weak targets and weak scheme betrays the science. And Australia's waving the flag saying, hey, it's okay if we lose the Great Barrier Reef, the Murray-Darling Basin, and the tens of thousands of jobs and people that require them. The Prime Minister's correctly said we've got to try and make sure we avoid dangerous climate change, but Professor Garnaut recommended to achieve that we needed a target of 25% cut by 2020. The 15% cut won't get us there, it won't give us credibility in the international arena, and I think the government has to go back to the drawing books.
By contrast, business and affected industry groups have so far, on the whole, reacted fairly positively to the government's approach. A response sweetened not just by the target range, but also by the significant assistance measures. The number of industries eligible for free carbon permits has been expanded and will now include the LNG sector. And $3.9 billion has been set aside to compensate coal-fired power generators. There will also be significant assistance for low and middle income families and pensioners to compensate for a predicted 1.1% overall increase in prices. Pensions will increase by 2.5% and almost 90% of low income households will get assistance 20% above their cost of living rises.
ACOS called in terms of the CPRS scheme for full compensation for low-income and vulnerable Australians. On first reading of the household assistance package, it appears that the government's in fact met that commitment. So we're really pleased to see that.
This is the balance the government is looking for, a balance between the economy, the environment and the electorate. It is also a balance between the long-term possibilities and short-term politics. The White Paper now needs to pass the Senate, and there's one big target in the politics of all that.
It's time for the real Malcolm Turnbull to stand up. Is it the Malcolm Turnbull who was supposed to be gung-ho about this 12 months ago? Or is it the Malcolm Turnbull of today seeking some short-term political advantage?
The government has to ensure that it acts responsibly. Mr Rudd will be very irresponsible if he brings in an emissions trading scheme which has the effect of exporting jobs and exporting emissions, doing great damage to our economy and doing nothing to save the Great Barrier Reef or the Murray-Darling Basin.
The opposition has initiated an independent inquiry of its own to assess the impact of the White Paper before it delivers a formal response. But it's clear that despite Mr Turnbull's past enthusiasm for action, there are some real divisions within his own side about how best to proceed from here. Some are still wedded to an ETS starting a year or so later than the government's proposed start date of 2010, and others think, particularly in the current economic environment, that it should be delayed or even shelved. This will be a significant test of Malcolm Turnbull's leadership, and the government is determined to make it as tough as it can.